The crunch point for fuels still actually is only about to hit us. To date, we've still been living off the fuel which left the Strait of Hormuz before the war began. That runs out in the next week or so the government's still going to have to manage us through a structural shortage in Asia, which will last at least until the end of May.
Welcome. We've seen the price of energy futures plunge. How quickly will those prices be reflected at the petrol pump?
Well, Trump has found an off-ramp to his ridiculous and bombastic ultimatum made to the Iranian regime. However, he hasn't found an off-ramp to the full scale of the energy market crisis that the war has caused. Now, we are seeing oil prices come down in the wake of the ceasefire announcement, and it is providing some welcome relief to the market, that there's at least a line of sight to the conflict and therefore the disruption to the Strait of Hormuz to end. But for us at home, and we're going to our servos to get some fuel, there's a lag effect here where until today, we've still been running off the fuel that left from the Gulf before the war began. That runs out in the next week or so. And even with the ceasefire now in place, which could see 170 million barrels of oil that's sitting stuck in tankers finally get out and make its way to Australia via refiners in Asia, that is a 6 or so week process. And so in between, we still face a crunch point for fuels from the second half of April through to May. What the announcement does do is at least gives us some signs that we could have relief from May onwards as flows resume. And that is going to allow the government and Australians to plan better and not have to worry about facing an ongoing crisis with no end in sight.
And that is, of course, if all goes well, Saul. Do investors or have investors in their initial reaction been overly optimistic about just how much progress has been achieved?
Look, I fear the market has been overly optimistic. It's been very sensitive and moving around every time Trump puts something on social media. We should have kind of learned better by now that something he says today, he can say the opposite tomorrow. But to give you an indication, if the Strait opens, and there's still a real risk that this ceasefire may not hold, but if it does, that doesn't mean all the production which has been shut in will restart immediately. That can take 1 to 2 months. There's also been permanent damage done to quite a significant amount of oil export infrastructure, which could take months or even years to repair. And this could leave Iran feeling both more paranoid and more emboldened to threaten the Strait of Hormuz going forward. And that's going to see markets put a risk premium on prices for all volumes through the Strait on an ongoing basis for the foreseeable future. And you put all these things together, and oil prices are not going to go back down to where they were prior to the war. And we're still looking at a tighter market with higher prices, potentially not just for months, but even for a few years to come, as a repercussion of just a 6-week war.
Donald Trump posted that this could be the golden age of the Middle East. But is it now clear that Iran has actually secured greater control of the Strait than it held before, as well as perhaps a licence to charge ships to pass through?
That's right. The noise being made out of the Iranians and some other reports suggests that rather than having an open and free Strait of Hormuz, we may have a Strait of Hormuz which is just under Iranian control, which they can flex up and down for any political purpose they see fit. That is going to, mean the restoration of passage to the Strait is going to be a slow and only partial process to begin with. But secondly, even if it was fully opened, the market's still going to put a lot of risk around that. So you'll see higher shipping costs, higher insurance costs, and a risk premium put on the oil price, even if there is no disruption that happens. And that's why you can't unscramble this egg and go back to the way oil markets behaved prior to the war. We are in a fundamentally different dynamic now, and that's going to last for years and doesn't just stop and go back to the way it was because the war ends, if it ends.
What does all of this mean for the federal government's efforts to underwrite fuel shipments at elevated prices on the spot market? How long is it going to have to keep that up for?
Well, the crunch point for fuels still actually is only about to hit us. To date, we've still been living off the fuel which left the Strait of Hormuz before the war began. That runs out in the next week or so. So the government's still going to have to manage us through a structural shortage in Asia, which will last at least until the end of May. So the government's efforts here in underwriting fuel, assisting with logistics, and in particular having the highest level diplomatic engagements with our trade partners to ensure we remain a priority for their fuel exports, that has to continue, both to get us through this initial shortage period, but also because this ceasefire may not hold, and then we'll be back to where we were only a few days ago. And so those efforts by the government remain critically important to be sustained at least for the next 6 weeks.
And so when comparing the government's efforts to underwrite those fuel shipments to the economic cost of going without, is there any doubt in your mind that it is a price worth paying?
There is no doubt whatsoever that making sure we have availability of fuel is absolutely critical for not just our energy security, but our economic welfare and frankly for our national security. And the government's efforts that's been here, there's no risk of them having gone overboard. If we've ended up having to pay a little bit more in taxpayer money and diplomatic efforts in order to make sure that we have fuel available in a crisis time, that has been effort and money extremely well spent. And that is because it's one thing to have to pay a bit more at the pump for our fuel, but it's quite another thing for our economy to not be able to get fuel at any price. That would be absolutely diabolical. It would see core vital economic corridors shut down in our country, and the ramifications of that would last for years, not just for the few weeks that we have a fuel shortage. So I think we should be commending the government's efforts that they've taken, and if anything, encouraging them to do more and to sustain it until we have an absolute clear line of sight that the shortage and for fuel and the crisis around that is over.
Keeping in mind the many variables that you've already discussed, how long could it take for the price of oil futures to reach their pre-war levels?
I'm not sure oil prices going to pre-war levels are on the cards, at least in the next few years. Even in the most optimistic case scenario here, we're still looking at a structurally tighter market for a few years hence. And I think we just need to brace ourselves for that prices at the pump, they can come down, but I think we're still looking at prices being at least 10, if not 20, 30% higher than they were in January.
Saul Kavonic, thank you.
Thank you.